The Arizona sky burned low and red, like a dying forge, when Illy Carter first saw the smoke. He was mending fence posts that morning, sweat rolling down his neck, his hands rough and cracked from a life that never gave him much but the work. The air was still, no wind, no bird calls, just the creak of old wire and the sigh of his horse shifting its weight behind him. Then he saw it, a thin black column rising from behind the far ridge, twisting up into the sky like a signal no one wanted to answer. At first he thought it might be lightning fire, one of those summer strikes that chewed up brush and left cattle scattered for miles. But something in the shape of it, the way it climbed steady and angry, told him this was no accident. The smoke of wood and canvas, maybe leather, maybe worse. He spat, wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, and looked toward the sun, hanging swollen and bright over the desert. The fence could wait. Whatever was burning wasn't far, a few miles across the dry wash, and into the scrubland that stretched toward the hills his father used to call Apache Mesa. That land was supposed to be empty. He knew better than most that it wasn't. Illy swung into the saddle, his old Appaloosa groaning under the weight of both man and age. "Come on, Ghost," he muttered, clicking his tongue. "Let's see what hell's cooking out there." The ride was slow at first, careful. The land here was treacherous gullies deep enough to break a leg, mesquite thorn thick as nails. The smoke grew darker as he neared the ridge, the air turning acrid. He could taste it before he could see it. Burnt hide, scorched grain, something else underneath that made his stomach twist. By the time he crested the rise, he reined the horse hard, breath catching in his throat. Below him lay what once might have been a small Apache camp, half a dozen lodges. Now nothing but charred poles and ash. The earth was blackened in wide circles, and the air shimmered with the heat of the fires still dying out. Silence sat heavy on the place, broken only by the crackle of wood and the faint sound of a hawk circling overhead. Illy dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the sand. The stillness was wrong, too complete, too final. He'd seen fights before, raids, cattle rustlers shot and left to rot, but never this. This was slaughter. He moved among the ruins, his hand resting on the rifle strapped across his back, eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of life. Then he heard it, a low, broken sound, like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of dust. He turned sharply. Beneath a burned blanket near the far end of the camp, something shifted. Illy knelt, heart pounding, and pulled the edge of the cloth away. Underneath lay a girl, maybe 16, her long black hair matted with soot and blood. Her arm was bent at an ugly angle, and the side of her dress was torn where a bullet had grazed her ribs. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, sharp, defiant even in the face of death. She tried to reach for something beside her, a knife, maybe, but her fingers closed on nothing but sand. "Easy now," Illy said quietly, raising both hands. "I ain't here to hurt you." The girl stared up at him, breathing shallow, her lips cracked from the heat. She said something in her own language first, too soft for him to catch. Then in halting English, she whispered words that stopped him cold. "Please," she said, voice trembling, "just make it fast." For a long moment he didn't move. The wind stirred the ashes around them, carrying the smell of ruin. She thought he was one of them, whoever had done this. A man come to finish the job. Illy swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every mile of land his family had claimed, every handshake deal and boundary line carved into someone else's earth. He looked at her, really looked, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, shame. "I ain't killin' nobody today," he said, his voice rough, steady. He laid his rifle down in the dirt and took a step back. The girl's eyes flickered once, still locked on him. Then she exhaled, a sound halfway between a sob and a sigh, and her body went limp. Illy caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin burned under his hands, fever hot. She was light, too light. He lifted her into his arms, glancing once more at the ruined camp, and then toward the horizon where the smoke still rose in thin ribbons. "God help me," he muttered. "What have I just walked into?" He turned toward home, the dying sun painting the desert gold behind him, and the girl the last living ember of what had been lay silent against his chest. The girl came to just before midnight. Iliad carried her through miles of dark desert, following the dim line of his own ranch lights until the moon rose high over the mesa. She'd burned with fever the whole way, her head lolling against his chest, whispering words in Apache he couldn't understand. He thought she might die before they made it, but she clung to life the way desert roots cling to stone. He laid her on the old cot in his bunkhouse, the one that had seen more sick calves and wounded strays than people. He tore strips from a clean flour sack, soaked them in whiskey, and cleaned the wound in her arm. It wasn't deep, but it was angry and hot to the touch. A bullet had grazed her ribs too shallow, thank God, and he wrapped it tight with what little linen he had left. By the time he finished, the room reeked of blood and spirits. He pulled a chair close to the cot and sat back, rubbing the grit from his eyes. The girl's breathing steadied, shallow but even. Outside, coyotes yipped across the canyon, their voices carrying long into the cold night. When she finally stirred, it was sudden. Her hand darted out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes flew open, dark and wild, darting around the small room. "Hey, hey," he said quickly, holding still. "You're safe now. You're in my ranch house. Nobody's gonna hurt you." She looked at him like she didn't believe a word. Her lips were dry, voice barely a whisper when she spoke. "Why?" Illy blinked. "Why what? Why not finish it?" Her voice was hoarse, cracked, but her eyes were steady. "Please, just make it fast." The words hit him like a kick to the ribs. For a moment he couldn't breathe. She thought he'd saved her just to kill her slow, the way men did sometimes when they wanted to call cruelty mercy. He saw the fear behind her stillness, not the kind that screams or runs, but the kind that's already seen too much and is ready for the end. He stood up, the chair scraping across the floor. "I ain't killin' nobody, you hear?" His voice was rougher than he meant it to be. He took a breath, gentled it. "You got shot up, that's all. I brought you here to fix you up. You want to die, you'll have to do it yourself. I won't do it for you." She didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the bandage on her arm, then to the open door beyond him, where the wind moved the curtain like a ghost. For a long while neither of them said anything. Illy crossed to the stove, poured a tin cup of water, and brought it to her. She watched his every move, wary, like a caged animal waiting for the hand that fed it to strike. When he offered the cup, she hesitated, then took it with both hands and drank until she coughed. He couldn't help but notice the way her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from some old instinct that said to stay ready to fight. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked up at him, eyes narrowing as though measuring whether a name was something safe to give. Finally she said, "Taya, Taya." He repeated softly, nodding. "I'm Illy Carter." Her brow furrowed slightly. "You're a rancher." He nodded again, born and raised. Her gaze hardened. "This land." She gestured weakly toward the window. "Apache land." He didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't wrong. His father had built the Carter spread 30 years ago, staked the fences wide, and claimed it legal through the county. But Illy had always known whose ground he was really walking on. He'd seen the old trails, the painted stones half buried in sand, the bones that sometimes turned up after a hard rain. "I reckon it was," he said at last, "still is if you ask me." That seemed to confuse her. Most white men she'd met, he guessed, didn't say things like that. She turned her face away, her voice low. "My people, gone." The words were so quiet he almost missed them. Then she added, "Men on horses came, white men. Some wore blue coats, others black dusters. They shot, they burned." Illy felt the air go out of the room. He'd heard about those outfits, hired guns from the railroad company, clearing land for new track. They called it progress. He called it what it was. They didn't care who was there, she said, staring at the wall. "They said we must go. We said this is home." They laughed. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. What could he tell her? That not all ranchers were bad, that his family had done the same to build theirs. Every answer tasted like ash. Taya's voice broke the silence. "Why help me?" Illy looked down at his hands, at the scars from barbed wire and the stains that never washed out. "I don't rightly know," he said after a moment. "Maybe because nobody else would." She studied him, eyes searching for something she couldn't name. Finally, she turned away again, exhaustion pulling her back under. Within minutes, her breathing slowed. Illy sat back in his chair, staring at the dying coals in the stove. The question she'd asked, "Why help me?" stuck in his chest like a splinter. He told himself he'd done what any decent man would have. But deep down, he knew decency wasn't what drove him to carry her through the night. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something older than that, something tied to the land itself, to the ghosts beneath the sand. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of smoke still hanging over the mesa. Illy looked toward the window, where the desert stretched endless and empty. "Reckon there's no outrun in what's common," he murmured. Then he leaned back, rifle across his knees, and kept watch until dawn. The sun crawled up over the horizon, spilling pale gold through the cracks in the bunkhouse wall. Illy hadn't slept. He'd spent the long hours watching over the girl Taya as she drifted in and out of restless dreams, whispering words in her own tongue. Sometimes she'd flinch, as if a gunshot still echoed somewhere deep inside her head. Sometimes she called out names, none were answered. When the first light touched her face, she stirred. Her eyes opened slow and wary, like a deer stepping out into open country. For a moment she looked lost. Then she remembered the rancher, the bunkhouse, the bandages, and her expression hardened again. "You're safe," Illy said quietly, pouring black coffee into a tin cup. "Ain't nobody gonna find you here." She didn't answer. Her gaze moved to the door, to the sliver of desert beyond it. The wind outside carried the scent of mesquite smoke and dust. He could tell she was already thinking of leaving. He set the cup on the small table beside her. "You should drink. You've been out near a whole day." Taya looked at the cup as though it were a trap. Slowly, she reached for it and took a sip. The bitterness made her wince, but she kept drinking until it was gone. Illy sat back in his chair, stretching the stiffness out of his shoulders. "You remember what happened?" She nodded once, eyes distant. "They came at dawn." She said softly, 5, 6 men, some with beards, one with red scarf." Her voice wavered. "They shot the dogs first, then the men." He could see the scene as she spoke, the sudden terror of gunfire breaking the morning stillness, the smell of burning hide and flesh, the screams, the confusion. She was too young to have seen what she'd seen, too young to talk about death like it was an old acquaintance. "I ran," she continued, her hand trembling slightly. "My father told me go to the hills. I did. But one man saw me. He fired. I fell." She paused, her jaw tightening. "When I woke, they were gone, all gone." Illy stared at the floor, his gut twisting. He'd heard about the railroad hiring mercenaries to drive people off their land, Apaches, settlers, anyone who stood in the way of the new line. He'd even been offered money to sell his grazing rights for the company's expansion. He'd told them no. The man who'd made the offer, a slick, talking foreman named Colby, had smiled in a way that said, "You'll change your mind." Now, sitting there listening to Taya's voice shake as she spoke about her family, Illy wondered if this was the same crew. "They weren't soldiers, were they?" he asked carefully. She shook her head. "No blue coats, only greed." He nodded grimly. "I know the kind." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Illy poked at the stove, pretending to fuss with the fire. He didn't want her to see the anger building in him. Not at her, at the men who did this. At himself, too, maybe, for ever being part of the same world that could make something like this seem ordinary. Taya watched him, her dark eyes unreadable. "You are angry," she said finally. He looked up. "You're damn right I am." At them, he hesitated, at a lot of things. Her gaze held his for a moment. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "Anger makes ghosts stay." He frowned. "What's that mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and turned her face toward the window. Outside, the wind was picking up, sending little swirls of dust across the yard. The sound of it filled the silence between them. After a while, Illy said, "You got anyone left? Any kin nearby?" She shook her head slowly. "My people scattered. Some gone north, some east. I was youngest, no one left. He felt the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. A 16-year-old girl, alone in a world that wanted her erased. You can stay here a while, he said. Rest. I'll figure something out. She turned back to him, suspicion flickering across her face. Why help me? He thought about it, really thought about it. He could have said something easy, that it was the right thing to do, that he couldn't just leave her out there. But the truth went deeper. Maybe it had started the moment he saw the smoke. Maybe even before that. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe because someone ought to. That seemed to soften something in her. Not much, but enough. She studied him for a long time, then gave a small nod. Illy rose and went to the door, looking out over the ranch. The land stretched wide and unforgiving, a sea of gold and rust under the growing sun. Somewhere out there, those men were still riding, still burning, and they were getting closer. He felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, sharp and dangerous as the edge of a blade. When he turned back to Taya, she was watching him. They will come again, she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Yeah, he said, I reckon they will. She didn't look afraid, only certain. Then you must be ready. He gave a slow nod. Don't you worry about me, girl. I've been ready my whole damn life. But as he said it, he knew it wasn't quite true. He wasn't ready for what was coming. He wasn't ready for the blood, or the ghosts, or the choices waiting just beyond the horizon. Still, he holstered his Colt, stepped out into the morning sun, and breathed deep. Somewhere out there, the desert still smoked with the ashes of what had been her home, and now, maybe, his fight too. The next 3 days dragged by slow and tense. The desert held its breath, and so did Illy. He spent the daylight hours patching the barn roof, fixing the corral gate, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind off the unease crawling under his skin. Every sound, the flap of a hawk's wings, the creak of wood in the wind, made him glance toward the horizon. Taya stayed mostly in the bunkhouse. She moved quiet as a shadow, her arms still wrapped tight, but healing fast. She never complained, never asked for more than water or a blanket when the nights grew cold. Sometimes Illy caught her standing outside at dawn, barefoot in the dust, facing the rising sun. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering words he didn't understand. It wasn't prayer in the way he knew it, but it was something older, something steadier. She didn't speak much to him, but when she did, her words cut clean. Once, while he was cooking beans on the stove, she asked, "Do you believe land remembers?" Illy looked up from the pan, puzzled. "Remembers what? People," she said simply. "Blood, footsteps, promise." He thought about it a long while before answering. "Maybe it does. My pa used to say a man leaves a mark where he walks, whether he means to or not." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Then this land remembers mine, maybe yours too." Illy had no reply for that. He just stared into the fire, feeling its heat on his face, thinking about all the marks he'd left behind, fences, graves, regrets. On the fourth morning, the wind shifted. Illy felt it before he saw it, a strange heaviness in the air, the way animals go quiet before a storm. He stepped out of the barn, squinting toward the ridge line to the east. 5 dots moved slow against the glare of the sun. Riders. He cursed under his breath and reached for his rifle. Through the old spyglass he kept by the door, he could make out dusters, rifles glinting, and one man in a red scarf. The same kind Taya had described. He lowered the glass, jaw tight. Son of a bitch. Inside the bunkhouse, Taya must have felt the change too. She appeared at the doorway, face pale, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. "They come," she said, not as a question but a statement. "Yeah," Illy said grimly, "they come." She moved closer, voice urgent. "They will kill you. You helped me. They never leave witnesses." Illy checked the chamber of his rifle, loaded 6 rounds, and slung it over his shoulder. "Let him try." He stepped out into the yard, scanning the landscape. The sun was sinking fast, turning everything bronze and blood. Red. The riders were still a mile out, maybe less. They moved slow, deliberate, like men certain of victory. Taya stood beside him, trembling but unbroken. "You can still go," she said. "Hide in the hills. I will not tell them you were here." Illy looked at her, something like a sad smile tugging at his mouth. "Ain't in me to run, girl. I've been standin' on this dirt my whole life. If I leave now, it'll mean they were right, that this land belongs to whoever's willin' to spill the most blood for it." She shook her head. "You fight, you die. Maybe," he said, adjusting his hat. "But maybe they do too." By the time the riders reached the edge of the ranch, the light had gone copper and the shadows long. Dust curled around their horses' hooves as they spread out, 5 figures like vultures circling carrion. The man in the red scarf rode at the front, his grin visible even from a distance. "Carter," he called out, voice carrying over the dry wind. "Heard you been playin' doctor to some savages." Illy stepped forward, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "You boys lost," the man laughed, not hardly. "We're collectin' what's owed. Railroad wants this land cleared, and that includes whatever filth you're hidden in your barn." Taya stiffened behind him, and Illy could feel her breath catch. "Don't reckon I owe you a damn thing," he said. The red, scarved man Colby, Illy now remembered, tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Then we'll take it anyway." The first shot cracked the silence. A splinter of wood flew from the porch post beside Illy's head. Instinct took over. He dropped behind the trough and fired back, the report echoing across the flat. One of the riders tumbled from his saddle, his horse bolting. Gunfire thundered in the twilight, the air filled with dust, smoke, and the smell of burned powder. Illy moved fast, years of ranch work turning into muscle memory. Reload, fire, duck, move. The men tried to flank him, circling the barn, but he knew his land better than they did. He caught one near the corral fence and dropped him clean with a single shot. Then came the scream, Taya's voice, sharp and desperate. Illy turned just in time to see one of the men dragging her from the bunkhouse, his arm locked around her throat, a revolver pressed to her temple. "Drop it, Carter," Colby shouted, stepping out from behind a hay wagon. "Drop it, or she dies." Illy froze. The world narrowed to that one scene, the girl struggling in the man's grip, the dust swirling between them, Colby's grin wide and cruel. His finger twitched on the trigger, but he didn't fire, not yet. Taya stopped struggling. She looked straight at Illy, her eyes calm, steady. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Just make it fast." Illy's throat closed. He saw again that burned camp, the broken bodies, the way she'd said those same words once before. And he knew what she meant, that she'd rather die than go through that hell again. But he couldn't. Not this time, not her. He lowered the rifle slowly. "All right," he said, voice even. "You win." Colby chuckled, motioning to his men. "Thought you'd see sense." Then Illy did the thing no one expected, the thing even he hadn't planned. He took one step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see the dirt on Colby's boots. The mercenary raised his gun, ready to end it, but Illy moved first. He lunged for the burning lantern that hung from the barn post and hurled it straight at Colby. It hit his chest, shattering glass and spilling fire. The flames caught his coat, racing up in a bright, roaring bloom. Colby screamed, stumbling back, slapping at the blaze. Taya twisted free, kicking the man holding her. Illy Dove rolled through the dirt, grabbed the fallen revolver, and fired twice. Both shots found their mark. The other riders broke, shouting, scrambling for their horses. One stayed long enough to drag Colby, still burning, into the saddle before tearing off into the dusk. When the last echo of hooves faded, the only sound left was the crackle of the burning barn wall. Illy dropped to his knees, chest heaving. His rifle lay half, buried in the dust beside him. Taya stood a few paces away, the firelight flickering across her face. She was shaking, her hair tangled, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Illy looked up at her, his voice rough and low. "You all right?" She nodded, though her lips trembled. "You could have killed me," she whispered. He looked down at the gun in his hand, then at the dying fire. "Yeah," he said softly, "but I didn't." The flames licked higher, painting the night orange. Above them, the stars began to come out, one by one, indifferent and cold. And for the first time since that morning he'd seen smoke on the horizon. Illy Carter wondered if this land, his land, her land, all of it could ever truly be washed clean. The night air stank of smoke and blood. The fire from the barn had burned itself down to embers, and what was left hissed and popped in the dirt. The sky above was a vast, empty black, with only a few stars pushing through the haze. Illy stood there in the flickering half-light, rifle hanging loose in his hand, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. Taya sat on the ground beside the water trough, her face pale and streaked with soot. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, watching the dying flames like she was seeing ghosts in them. Maybe she was. Illy holstered his gun and crouched down beside her. "You hurt?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. Her voice came out small, "No." Then, after a pause, "You killed them." Illy nodded. "Some, not all. The rest'll be back." She didn't flinch. She just kept staring at the ashes. "Then they will bring more." He sighed, running a hand over his face. His skin was raw from smoke and grit. "Yeah, probably." Silence stretched between them, heavy and uneasy. Out in the dark, the horses shifted nervously, picking up the scent of blood. A coyote howled somewhere on the ridge, a lonely sound that rolled across the desert and faded into the nothing beyond. Finally, Taya turned to look at him. "You could have killed me," she said again, like she still didn't understand why he hadn't. Illy met her eyes. They were the same deep brown as the earth after rain, old, steady and tired. Wasn't gonna happen. Her brow furrowed. "Why not?" He gave a rough laugh, shaking his head. "You're just a kid. Ain't right for one and for another." He trailed off, looking down at his hands that had fired more bullets than he could count, built fences across land that wasn't his, dug graves for men he never meant to kill. For another, "I'm done puttin' folks in the ground that don't deserve it." Taya studied him for a moment, her face unreadable. Then she said, "You are not like them." He barked a bitter laugh. "Don't be too sure. I've worked for the same bastards who hired those men. I just didn't pull the trigger for 'em. That is difference enough," she said quietly. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her arm was still bandaged, her clothes torn and streaked with ash, but there was something unbreakable in her posture. Even after all she'd lost, she held herself like someone who refused to bow to the world. Illy stood and walked a few paces away, watching the last flames die out. The barn was gone. What little remained were black beams jutting out like ribs. His father's tools, his hay, his supplies, all of it turned to smoke. He should have felt rage or grief, but what filled him instead was a strange calm. Taya's voice came from behind him. "They will come again," she said. "They will bring more men. They will burn more." "I know," Illy said. "You cannot fight them all." He turned and looked at her, a shadow in the faint firelight. "Maybe not, but I can make sure they think twice before trying again." She rose unsteadily to her feet. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying sparks from the dying fire into the dark. "You will die, maybe," he said again, almost smiling, "but maybe I'll take a few of them with me." Her gaze softened, not pity exactly, but something close to respect. "Why do you fight for me?" she asked. He hesitated. The question hit deeper than he wanted it to. He thought about his father, the man who'd taught him to shoot, to work, to stake claims, to take what wasn't nailed down because that's how the West works, boy. He thought about all the years he'd looked the other way while others paid the price for that kind of thinking. Maybe this was him trying to balance something that could never be balanced, because somebody should have, he said finally. "And nobody else will." The night grew colder. They built a small fire with what scraps of wood they could salvage, huddling close for warmth. Neither spoke for a long time. The flames crackled softly, casting long shadows across the sand. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "When they burned our camp, my father told me something. He said, if wind survives the fire, it still carries the smell of smoke." Illy glanced at her, not sure what to say. "He meant," she continued, "that even when we live, the things we lose follow us. You saved me, but I am still ash inside." He stared into the fire. "Maybe," he said, "but even ash can grow something new if the rain ever comes." She looked at him, puzzled by his words, then smiled faintly, the first time he'd seen her smile at all. It was small and tired, but it was real. Illy leaned back against the trough, the weight of the day pressing down hard. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "We'll need to move come morning. They'll be back with more guns and less patience." Taya hesitated. "And you?" "I'll stand watch," he said, though his eyelids felt heavy as stone. She nodded, curling up by the fire. Within minutes she was asleep, her breathing steady, her face turned toward the stars. Illy sat there in the silence, the rifle across his lap, staring out into the black. Every sound felt sharp, every whisper of wind, every creak of the land settling. He thought about what came next. Maybe he'd ride her north to the San Carlos reservation, though he doubted she'd be welcome there. Maybe they'd head for the mountains, start over somewhere nobody cared who owned what. Or maybe the desert would take them both before sunrise. He sighed and rubbed at his face, the stubble scratching against his palm. Somewhere inside, beneath the fatigue and the pain, a strange peace began to settle, in the kind that comes when a man finally stops running from the truth. He looked once more at Taya, sleeping by the fire, then at the horizon where the stars touched the land. "Fast," he muttered to himself, echoing her words from that first day. "You wanted it fast. Guess nothing in this life ever is." Then he stood, tightening his grip on the rifle as the wind began to rise again, dry, whispering, and heavy with the scent of smoke. By dawn, the fire was out and the desert lay still again. The barn was nothing but a heap of smoldering timbers and twisted metal. Smoke rose in thin gray ribbons that caught the first pale light, drifting toward the hills like ghosts finding their way home. The world was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that follows violence and tries to pretend it never happened. Illy sat on the porch steps, a blanket over his shoulders, the rifle still across his knees. He hadn't slept. The firelight had burned itself into his eyes, and every time he closed them, he saw the faces of the men he'd shot and the ones he hadn't. His hands ached from gripping the gun so tight. He wasn't sure if it was fear or guilt that kept them trembling. Maybe both. Taya emerged from the bunkhouse, wrapped in one of his old coats that swallowed her whole. Her hair was tangled, her feet bare, her face streaked with soot that even the night air hadn't washed away. Still, she walked steady. She had that same quiet grace she'd had since the first moment he saw her. Even now, after everything, Illy looked up at her, his voice rough from the long night. "Morning," she nodded. "You did not sleep." He gave a tired half-smile. "Didn't feel right to." Taya stepped closer, her gaze sweeping over the ruins of the barn. The smell of burned wood hung heavy in the air. "It is gone," she said softly. "Yeah," Illy said, following her eyes. "Whole damn thing." They stood there together for a while, watching the last of the smoke curl away. A few chickens pecked nervously near the water trough, their feathers singed but alive. The horses had bolted during the fight. Illy could see their tracks leading off toward the wash. It would take days to round them up again. Maybe he wouldn't bother. You could build again, Taya said after a long pause. Illy snorted, shaking his head. "Could, but I don't think I will." "Why?"